So welcome everyone to this evening's seminar on place-based histories beyond the academy. Shortly, our four speakers, Louise Ryland-Epton from the Victoria County History in Gloucestershire and Wiltshire, William Wyeth from English Heritage, and Chris Harris and Danny Dolan from Halifax Heritage Tours will talk to us about their experiences of engaging in place-based historical research beyond the academy. But before they do, we would like to quickly introduce the Institute of Historical Research's Centre for the History of People, Place and Community and the University of York's Institute for the Public Understanding of the Past, or IPUP for short, who are co-hosting this evening's event. So the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community fosters engaged, innovative research into placed histories across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban and the parish to the metropolis, with an emphasis on the localised, the micro-historical and the site-specific. It also works together with others to develop imaginative new approaches to making history and to identify opportunities for history to make a difference in the real world today. You may have heard of the Centre's two flagship projects, which are the Victoria County History, which is a national network of place-based historians working towards writing the history of every place in England. And Louise, I'm sure, will mention this in some capacity shortly. And Layers of London, which is a digital resource providing an access to historical maps of London and opportunities for members of the public to share knowledge about specific places in London. The Centre is positioned within the Institute of Historical Research, which is a physical place in London, but is also a global community dedicated to participating in, supporting and engaging everyone in the process of making history. So everybody is welcome to be part of the IHR's community. So I'm now going to pass over to Victoria to introduce IPUP.
Thanks very much, Ruth. So for those who don't know me, I am Dr. Victoria Hoyle, and I am a senior lecturer in public history at the University of York. And one of my responsibilities there is as director of IPUP, which, as Ruth said, is the Institute for the Public Understanding of the Past. IPUP is a research and teaching centre in the Department of History at the University of York, and our remit is to explore the many ways in which the past is interpreted, used, circulated and consumed in society. This includes in museums, in archives, at heritage sites, as well as through local and community projects, film, television, media and politics. We run a very well-established Masters in Public History with around 25 students a year who go on to work and research in diverse areas and aspects of the heritage landscape. We're very pleased to be partnering with the Centre for People, Place and Community this evening and to welcome our four speakers, including Danny and Chris from Halifax, who we've been working directly with through IPUP for the past 4 years and who have one of our students with them at this very moment. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. It's a real pleasure. I, as Ruth said, will be chairing the questions at the end, but I'm now going to stop talking and hand over to the first of our speakers, Louise.
Hi, thanks for that. That was a brilliant introduction. I am Dr. Louise Ryland-Epton and I'm a freelance historian and editor. And aside from my place-based history stuff, I also work for an academic journal and for a small local history publisher. Now, in my contribution to this seminar, however, I'm going to reflect on my practice, which developed from or ran in parallel to my work producing place-based histories for the Victoria County History Trust project, specifically in Wiltshire on volume 20, which is on Chippenham and the surrounding area. Now, the Victoria County History, or VCH, as we like to call it for short, produced place-based histories in iconic red volumes, and I imagine that most of you are familiar with them. If not, they're primarily reference works. The subject matter is heavily prescribed. Every paragraph, sometimes every single sentence, is referenced back to a primary source. And consequently, they're not the most exciting volumes to read cover to cover. And often, as a contributor to these volumes, I must leave out interesting stuff or refer to it only briefly. However, since 2018, I've been working with communities to use VCH research in other ways to present history in a less structured manner across a number of different formats. I've decided to approach this evening by discussing what I'm doing presently and then looking back at what I've done previously. Currently, I'm working on a Wiltshire VCH spin-off publication, specifically a book with Langley Borough Parish Council. It's a small village, a mile or two from Chippenham, and I'm going to be producing a popular history book of their parish that is based on my VCH research, but uses none of my VCH words. This project developed from work I completed for them in 2022-23, when the Parish Council commissioned me to provide content for a heritage trail. And this followed the success of another spin-off publication. Now, the heritage trail was created with the help of 2 local volunteers. I find that my outputs are always better if I have local input. I used my VCH research, but it was developed as it encompassed sites and aspects not mentioned in my VCH draft, which in turn I find I can use to improve my VCH text, and that's certainly what I've done. And actually, this use of my VCH research in a number of different ways, and then using those outputs to work back into my VCH drafts is something that has characterized my work for the last few years. Now, the book I'm currently working on uses a similar thematic chapter arrangement to my VCH place-based histories, which makes it easier for me to rewrite the text. But it's written in a much more accessible and engaging way. And the chapters are broken up by case studies where I focus on elements, often individual lives, in the community's history. In this particular case, this includes the 17th century church minister Thomas Webb, or the lust-loving parson, as he was characterized at the time. Now, these extra bits are developed from things that I probably found interesting, but weren't referenced in the VCH volume or the Heritage Trail, and things which I have found that the community wants to know a bit more about. I've also done some independent research on Maud Heath, a legendary medieval woman who lived in the parish. Now, this was written up into an academic article, which will be published at the end of the year. And as it finally laid to rest who Maud Heath actually was, it made the local BBC news. I also provided some text for a museum exhibition on Maud Heath and did several local talks, and organised a women's history symposium, part of the 550th year anniversary celebration of a gift that Maud made. This research I laid back into my place-based text and my VCH draft too. My work also uncovered 2 moated sites whilst I was researching for the VCH, one of which was a possible small settlement, which generated a lot of interest on the ground, and through some contact, we've also managed to do some archaeological investigation off the back of it. So you can see that although this is a popular history book, it incorporates some really interesting academic research. I hope that the book will be published in the summer. But I'm also working to help plan events in 2026 to celebrate the publication of our VCH volume in the Chippenham area. Now, I'm aware that possibly the majority of residents of Chippenham aren't acquainted with the VCH, although I have tried in the last few years to reach as many people as I can within my practice. Certainly, the vast majority of people wouldn't be interested in reading our volume anyway. But the launch, whilst it will provide some formal events, also gives us an opportunity to try and connect with some more of the community. So, based on a number of well-known people from the areas past, which we've mentioned in the VCH volume, and with some generous seed money from the local town council, we're starting to plan what feels like it will be a local history festival from March to September next year. Currently titled Chippenham Our History, it could involve street art and creative responses alongside talks and lectures on various aspects of the area's past. An exhibition has been booked to celebrate the 400th anniversary of John Aubrey, probably the town's most famous son. And we want to create a programme that is accessible to all, as well as to promote the volume and the VCH brand. Now, it's very early doors, but I think it's hugely exciting. Now, in the past, I've been a bit sniffy about creative responses to place-based research, but no longer. I've seen how in the last 12 months, it really can connect with people. With my own practice, in the last 12 months, I've inspired poetry, and stemming from one of the biggest stories that I uncovered, a lady in North America it has been in contact with me to tell me she's penning a play, and someone in Chippenham has told me they're writing a novel. So this makes me very proud and excited with where our research can take us. Now, talk of this reminds me of the project I most often get asked about. It's the Bremhill Parish History Project, which began all the way back in 2017. And it began when a local businessman was approached by Wiltshire VCH to help them raise money for the Bremhill Parish chapter of Volume 20. So Bremhill is another village in the Chippenham area. Now, while Martin, who was approached, was an admirer of the VCH, he felt the fundraising might be easier if a more accessible and engaging community history book could be produced at the same time, something with a broader remit and a range of contributors to the research and writing. I was the historian chosen to work on the project. It was early 2018 when I got involved. I had some experience at the VCH, but absolutely no experience in public history whatsoever. Why they employed me, I really don't know. The next 3 years were a huge learning curve. The group initially raised money from local sources to fund the project scoping phase and was turned down for Heritage Lottery Fund. So back to the drawing board, we produced an all singing, all dancing project where I created, I think it was 5 versions of the project plan. And basically I threw at it everything I could possibly think of. We managed to get lottery funding, and with some VCH help, we also secured a range of funding from other grant making bodies, which added up to in excess of £30,000. By 2018, the project included plans for history skills workshops, supported research sessions, oral history interviews, some test pitting, all of which was going to create a body of research to use in a variety of outputs. So this was going to include the VCH chapter and the book, but also talks, a website, a series of articles in the parish magazine and online, a heritage app, and educational materials for schools. All of this we planned would culminate in a grand Bremhill History Festival in 2020. Then COVID happened. Things were delayed, but we adapted largely by moving everything online. In the middle of 2021, the text of the book and the Red Book draft were complete with contributions from over 30 volunteers involved in research, photographs and illustrations, writing up case studies, contributing to the editing and indexation of the book and the book design. A second history festival and a book launch took place in December 2021. Our first festival did happen, but it was all online. And we squeezed 70 people into the village hall, which was the maximum that we were allowed to do at the time, given the need for social distancing. The book was well received by the community and it won an award, and then a year later it came out in paperback. Now, there were lots of benefits to the VCH from working in this way. our local profile was raised. The VCH got a chapter with a more modest investment than they would have otherwise had to make. And the community got a history book that they actually really wanted. And this was really, in every sense of the word, a collaboration. But they also got heritage trails, a website, festivals, and these were really good bespoke outputs. Using the skills that we have at VCH and by combining with a local history group in this way, this project provided materials that explored the heritage of Bremhill in so many accessible formats and meant many more people were engaged with their history than actually helped research the book. In fact, hundreds more. There was so much going on in this project. Skills were learned, friendships were made, and our monthly heritage Zoom talks were more important for many reasons during the lockdown, over and above the information that we were providing on the community's history. I found that writing things in a more relaxed, fun way, but keeping the research rigor, was very satisfying. And it's something I continue to enjoy, along with the discovery that extra research involved in producing those diverse outputs can be fed back into my VCH drafts. I also discovered that place-based research could feed my academic output too. Now, one of the stories that appeared in the Bremhill book and was only mentioned very briefly in the VCH draft was a witchcraft case. Now, this is something that I've continued to research since. Now, the case is significant as this was the earliest recorded execution for the crime of witchcraft in the country. And for several reasons, it's been overlooked by historians working on witchcraft. Now, last year, that research formed the basis of a paper I gave at the British Crime Historians Conference and an article that I did for a local history publication. It got interest from the BBC and I was interviewed a couple of times about it. It is this story that may become a play and a novel, which I alluded about earlier. My main academic focus presently is the antiquarian John Aubrey, whose 400th anniversary, you may recall, is next year. I used Aubrey's topographical and scientific writings throughout my research in the Chippenham area, and now I'm working with an Oxford University academic on this anniversary exhibition in Chippenham. I'm also producing an edition of his natural history, a work that's never been published before. And aspects of this work will be fed into the festival that we are planning and have already appeared in a VCH spin-off book. So to conclude, my experience has shown me that place-based historical research beyond the academy offers unique and powerful opportunities. By working directly with communities, I've discovered that historical knowledge doesn't have to be or doesn't need to be confined to academic publications or reference works to maintain its research vigor. We can create multiple pathways to access history, whether through trails or community books, festivals, or creative responses that engages a very broad audience for our place-based research. And I don't think we should be frightened about diminishing the scholarly value of our work. Rather, I see it as a way that we can enrich it. The insights from community members have benefited my work, and I've seen how transformative place-based research projects can be. Maybe I've made this sound quite straightforward, and really it isn't. I have had failures and frustrations, but by being open and flexible and communicating honestly and not assuming that I have all the answers either, I'm pleased with how it's turning out. So that's everything I have to say. I hope I haven't overrun. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I think I'm taking over now. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. If this fails, bear with me, everyone. Okay. Can we see that? No, that's not worked, is it?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay, let's try that.
Oh yeah, this is looking promising.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, that's all clear.
It's not on full screen. Oh, now it's on full screen. Perfect.
Cool.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep. Thanks, Louise, for that. That's really interesting. a lot of overlaps with the work that I do, but that's obviously why we've been putting this group together to speak. Thank you everyone for having me. I will be talking on the topic of castle communities in English heritage public history. So I'll get cracking. Who am I? I'm Will Wyeth. I work for English Heritage, which is a charity that cares for over 400 historic properties across England. I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a moment. I myself am an archaeologist and historian specialising in medieval castles, which is a great job. I work across England, but mainly in the north, so that's probably going to change a little bit in the future. Part of my job requires me to draw on all different sorts of evidence, some examples of which are on screen just now. So standing buildings is area of my expertise, and earthworks too, but I also venture into archives, which is probably a more common domain for some of us here. And I'm also interested in collections, which is material culture, artifacts, etc. I research and collaborate with others on the presentation of castles to English heritage members, and that's called interpretation, really is the industry word. And I do that across all sorts of media. So we've heard mention of kind of heritage trails, that's kind of a common medium. Do things like podcasts, audio guides, guidebooks, digital content's increasingly important, all sorts of different ways of interpreting with the past, engaging with the past, I should say. I also work with a team of experts. I'm very privileged in a big organisation like English Heritage to have colleagues who are experts in the fabric of buildings, for example, in collections, artifacts, in heritage interpretation, so I don't need to go and retrain. Experts in education and in volunteering and in digital media and outreach, etc. So lots of expertise to be able to call upon. How I think about place-based histories. So the National Collection is a very fancy word for saying the monuments and artifacts that form the core of English Heritage's business to care for these things, these places. Stonehenge and Dover Castle are two of the most famous ones, but there are hundreds of others. And these places are, by their very nature, brilliantly placed to lead on developing place-based histories and community heritage. I suppose they're anchored in those places. My outlook to meeting the challenges of doing such place-based histories outside the academy really falls for me into three parts. Firstly, I suppose the opening premise is if heritage is to be successful, I think Louise already mentioned this, it can change people and communities for the better. And to do so, it requires people to buy in, to really go for it. The second thing I want to talk about briefly is about how a great deal of subject specialist scholarship has a lot of potential to inform that success, and that's not just scholarship that's ongoing at the moment, but it's the things that are assigned to people when they go to university, for example, to study history and archaeology, or it's the things that appear in guidebooks from the 80s or public history books from the 60s and so on. There's a huge amount that can help our work. The last thing I wanted to briefly talk about as well, which it sounds quite high-minded, but it's really not. It's a philosophy of interpretation, a sense of why we're doing what we're doing, and I think that needs to be kind of reflected on and be able to adapt and change when you're working outside the academy. So in typical fashion, I've gone for a case study which dwells on Penrith Castle, which is in Cumbria. I'm assuming most of you are not familiar with the details of Penrith, so I've just got a few slides to show you what it looks like today. It is a conserved ruin, which is often the case for most English heritage castles, and indeed all heritage castles, in fact. So in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s of the 20th century, it was carefully looked after to be presented as it is now. There's a lot of standing fabric. You can see lots of bits of windows and doors still there. Not the easiest thing to interpret if you're not an expert, but there is something to work with. From the historical side, from the perspective of documentary evidence, it's not very rich, and part of that is because it was probably inhabited as an elite residence, which is what castles are for only about 150 years of its history, and after that it became something of an office, kind of an estate management place, and then a farm, and then a ruin, and it's quite a common story for castles in England. So the first point I want to touch on is getting buy-in from people to do place-based histories. it's worth saying from the outset, this isn't unique to English heritage properties, but sites are by and large cherished and valued by the communities in which they sit, whether that's urban or rural. And for English heritage, certainly, those communities play a growing role in the management, in the interpretation, and in the stewardship of those properties. That goes all the way from sweeping leaves. There are volunteers who enjoy doing that and volunteer their time to that, to also keeping keys, because some of our sites have got specific entry points, all the way up to people offering things like translation into different languages of information that English heritage generates, or indeed, as I'll talk about in a moment, interpreting the sites. So a little bit about Penrith. It's a small town in England's northwest, not too far from the border with Scotland. The castle itself is close to a popular railway station. Penrith is a gateway to the Lake District. It's close to that railway station, but also to a McDonald's, which is, it sounds like a strange thing for me to say, but this is important. The McDonald's has very little in the way of outdoor seating, and the nearest place you can sit down is across the road at a very nice 14th century castle, which is Penrith Castle, and that sits in a 20th century public park, so it's well laid out for people to be in. But otherwise, the park and the castle are surrounded by modern housing and retail areas, so it's an island of green with a castle in the middle. From an English heritage perspective, the castle is free to enter, which means you don't pay to go in, you never have. And there are 2 information boards at the castle, one of which is on screen there, titled Home for a Future King, which is an interesting perspective to take on the castle. The site is popular with tourists, restaurateurs, and locals, so it has quite a high footfall for a free site. Some free to enter properties English heritage looks after might get 15 or 20 visitors a month. Penrith, it's kind of low mid hundreds even in the winter, so that's quite a lot of visitors, for example. One day, a few years ago now, I was approached by a local volunteer who I'll call Jay, who was keen to develop the public history offer at the castle. Jay is local to Penrith Castle and volunteers to lead ad hoc but pre-booked tours of the site that she has developed and written in concert with people like me. And she decided that the 2 information boards were not really doing the job, especially when people had lots of questions and she wasn't equipped to answer them. So Jay and I worked together on thinking about a new piece of content, a new thing, which might meet her requirements for public history and English heritage's ambitions for Penrith Castle in the future. And we settled on a reconstruction image. So yeah. And this is where I talk a bit about the value of research, I suppose. I mentioned, I think, a great deal of subject specialist academic research has immense potential to facilitate the success of place-based histories in public history, and I think Penrith Castle in its own way can demonstrate that. Part of when I say subject specialist academic scholarship, it's not just publications, though that's a big part of it. It's about collaboration, things offered freely and in kind through I'll often be emailing academics across the world at all hours about particular points of historical inquiry, whether it's to do with language or with artifacts or with history. In fact, people in this call too, I've contacted for points of history as well. So that sense of research is as much about a community of researchers as it is about an output of scholarship. Another challenge, I suppose, working in place-based histories outside the academy is demonstrating the value of research, full stop. Members of the public and indeed a lot of people in society don't necessarily understand that value, and so there's a process, as Louise said, of kind of holding hand and kind of walking through what this means to do this work, I suppose. In the case of reconstruction research and for Penrith Castle, we almost have to start from zero and rethink the history of the castle, full stop. So I've said on the slide here, reconstruction requires a rethink of the history of the castle, and through 2 key strands, it's the approach that I've taken for Penrith. And there is the opportunity to undertake buildings research, which is the kind of thing that I do. So that's primary research in a way. I go and look at this place and I see, okay, I understand what's going on. And the second is to draw on relevant scholarship. I call that secondary research, but it often involves primary work as well. And as an example on the screen, I've got an article by David Yorath from Northern History published in 2016 on this figure from the mid-late 15th century history of Cumberland and Westmoreland, Sir Christopher Moresby, who is who will be important to the history of Penrith, as I'll speak about it in a moment. And again, collaboration on all these fronts is really important, whether it's the reconstruction or speaking to people. I just wanted to draw your attention to the two other sets of images on screen. On the bottom left is this wonderful Buck Brothers impression of the castle. Now, I know I've not given a kind of entire picture of the castle to be able to compare, but it doesn't look like that. I'll put it that way. And on the top right is some of the fruits of my own work to try to provide a comprehensive impression of the castle in its medieval heyday through quite a traditional format of kind of floor plans. The one on the left is largely the site as it is today, and the one on the right is carrying up the walls, which is always a risky business. And hopefully there's lots of clues to be able to do that. I mentioned the philosophy of interpretation, and I think that has to be kind of articulated quite well. I think the questions that we need to ask ourselves in place-based histories is whose story gets told, and how do we choose those narratives and themes? In my case, working with a single volunteer, a single stakeholder, really in this particular case, it was quite straightforward. And I'll talk a bit about the volunteers' kind of hopes and expectations in a moment. But I think that wider sense, even for the researcher themselves, to understand their own motivations and their own expectations, is very useful. I think reconstruction specifically requires you to think about what we're trying to show, again, why we're showing it. Specifically for Penrith, there is a problem of intelligibility in the remains. I see lots of interesting features in this image on the right here, but most people just see ruined stone buildings. The volunteer wanted the new image to be useful on days when they were volunteering at the site. And the funder, we got a bit of money from the Castle Studies Trust, who paid for the reconstruction. They wanted our work as part of making the reconstruction to inform our understanding of the castle as well as a historic property. So the philosophy of interpretation, these are really what the volunteer was interested in, wanted to get from the new image. They wanted to see a greater detail of life and people in the castle. There are other reconstructions of the castle, early reconstructions that take an aerial view, which are really great for architectural historians, but the people are like ants on them. It's quite difficult to anchor yourself in the place. Volunteer also wanted to get a sense of a typical day in castle life, which is often a question that comes up through tours. The reconstruction of parts of the castle should focus on parts not easily understood. So this photo on the top right is illustrative of that point. And it should also really easily connect to the standing fabric. What that means is if I see a reconstruction, I should be able to look up and understand immediately what it's referring to, because that can be an issue with reconstructions. And you'll see on the bottom right of the screen the beginnings of the sketch of the reconstruction as it emerges. And ta-da, the big reveal is the reconstruction proper on the right, with the inspiration image, indeed actually the basis of the reconstruction on the left. I encouraged the volunteer to kind of buy into this idea that when the reconstruction I mentioned, when you look up and you look down to see the reconstruction, then the place that you're in, to make it really easy for people to understand what they're looking at. So if you look at the photo on the left, there's a long wall that runs diagonally on the right that makes a short right angle, and that's the same wall that appears in the reconstruction. And the right angle there is the beginning of a stair block. On the left of the picture, in the distance, just to the left of where that tall column of stone with two windows is, there's a gap in the wall. And again, the reconstruction features that gap as, in fact, a gatehouse, a late medieval gatehouse as part of the castle. I mentioned David Yorath's article from Northern History in 2016. We have Sir Christopher Moresby, who was a big official working at the castle several times, responsible for some of the repairs, and he's in the picture on the left there in a nice green jacket, standing up with his staff in the style of someone who is operating as a steward or under steward. And we have lots of things going on in this scene. The focus is common folk queuing to have their pleas heard at these seated individuals on the left, but on the far left in the middle distance, we've got someone tending to a horse. On the far right, we've got a woman making a delivery of supplies to a castle on a wagon, and a household official being a bit skeptical. Just next to her is a child wrestling a dog. You may be able to zoom in to see that. Going back to the middle of the picture, in the middle distance, there are two children who are sweeping dung. They've caught sight of a cat that's on top of the wagon that was just being delivered, and they're kind of intrigued by that. And behind the cat in the background, in this dark covered space with the burn marks of a candle, is someone illicitly sampling the wares of the buttery, which is where beer and wine was kept in the castle. And above them is the Great Hall, one of the most important spaces of the castle, which is quite difficult to understand, where there are some people seated in bright elite clothing, having a chin wag, and some servants putting down a wall hanging. There are other scenes going on, but I mean, apart from the people, which are really the focus of this story, the volunteer really wanted people in the place and the perspective to be human. We have the buildings rebuilt as they would have been. And I'm aware I'm overrunning slightly. I just wanted to kind of capture the volunteers' response. They say this image is exactly what is needed. It captures the life of the castle that people will be able to relate to. There's that connection, which is really important. It gives an instant impression of how the castle might have looked and brings to life the people and their everyday activities. I should say, of course, a huge amount of research has gone into this image in terms of getting the details right. It's not perfect, but it is good. And they comment at the end, this picture will be especially useful as a talking point for local school groups who have started visiting the castle as part of their Key Stage 2. So it potentially has the insight to lead on to things we hadn't even planned for. That's it from me. Thank you for having me. There are a few other things I'm happy to talk about, projects that I'm working on at the moment, but that's it for now. I should say I'm going to hand over now to Danny and to Chris.
Thanks, Will. Could you stop sharing your screen? Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Danny and Chris, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. A big hello from a small industrial town in West Yorkshire. I can't see everybody's faces, but how many people have visited Halifax in West Yorkshire? Will, well done. Victoria, yeah. I can't see everybody else, but I just, yeah, good. Thank you very much. So some of you know where we come from. I can't present an academic story like has been presented just now, which has been fascinating. But I would like to tell you a little bit about my hometown. I was born here and I've lived here and worked here most of my life. Always lived here, not always worked in the area. But we're surrounded by hills. Halifax is sort of in the valley. It actually comes under the banner now of the last 50 years of Calderdale, when there was reorganisation within the council, the small towns that surrounded Halifax. Halifax is the largest town, population of probably around 90 to 100,000 at the moment. I haven't got the accurate figures, but the population of Calderdale as a whole in my working life was around 193 to 200,000. So Halifax is the smallest town in West Yorkshire. Yorkshire, being the biggest county in the country, is divided up into east, north, west and south. West Yorkshire is a county in its own right because of the population, the demographics. So each of those 4 areas used to be called ridings: East Riding, West Riding, North Riding, South Riding. Well, no, there wasn't a South Riding. There was a famous book. I think it was Winifred Holt, I think, who wrote South Riding. But lots of characteristics of Yorkshire: true grit and determination, and flying the flag wherever any of us work. I've worked internationally for a long time, and my go-to was come to Calderdale, come to Halifax. We're the smallest, as I say, in the 5 areas: Leeds, Bradford, Wakefield, Huddersfield, Kirklees and Calderdale. So being the smallest is a bit like being the hole in the donut. Various sort of grants kept being given over the many years. We always sort of fell short of it. We didn't quite have the demographics. We didn't quite have the geographical spread. And so we had to fight doubly hard. But again, that true Yorkshire grit spirit is there. Now, because of the hills, the history being sheep, wool, cottage industries, providing the workers in the houses, the cottages on the hills, making pieces of cloth. And so again, maybe you've all heard about the Peace Hall, which was opened in 1779. It's the last remaining cloth hall, certainly in Europe. Possibly, Danny might correct me on this, but I think it might even be in the world. There were cloth halls. Unfortunately, it didn't really work very well for probably about 20, 25 years. But then, of course, the Industrial Revolution was starting. So that meant the mills were starting. And the mills with the water, the rivers, trees were cut down on the hillsides so that the water would run off and go into the rivers to generate the mills. And the Industrial Revolution was big in this area, and some very famous names. Now, Halifax Heritage Tours was born out of myself and a friend who we worked together doing hidden gems tours in Halifax, probably over 20 years ago, perhaps. Just keen volunteers wanting to show the town from 1848, when the town was the corporation was started. We had a very old town hall. It was a Georgian town. And then this Victorian explosion. So when we take people on tours, we ask them to be very careful where they're walking, but to please look up at the height of the buildings. And from the Georgian period, when the buildings were quite low and quite simple, suddenly the Victorians came along and exploded the town. Big industrialists, benefactors to the town, philanthropists, all building their big businesses. One of the very biggest is a mill complex called Dean Clough. Dean and Clough in Yorkshire terms means valley. So Dean Clough is a network of mills where it became the biggest carpet manufacturer in the world, employing about 5,000 people. Gradually over time in the 20th century, there was more competition. And by 1980, there was only 500 people working there, as opposed to in its heyday, the 5,000. So a man called Sir Ernest Hall came along with a man called Jonathan Silver, who went on to develop Salts Mill in Bradford. And Sir Ernest remained with his son and a team there to develop Dean Clough Mills. That was one heck of an undertaking, because it was such a large site. But today, and in spite and despite COVID, which obviously was a dark time for all of us, there's probably just short of 5,000 people working there in all sorts of different, from artists to sculptors to a charity like myself. In 1991, a community foundation started there with some free office space. So a whole variety of industry and people working there, as Ernest used to call it, creating a practical utopia. So that's a really good example of repurposing a huge mill complex. And I think really, I could go on, but I think really I want you to know that there's a lot of energy going in to repurposing the mills, whether turning them into apartments or industrial units, as Dean Clough is. Where you see me speaking from, I'm in a repurposed old infirmary building, which opened in 1896. And Halifax Heritage Tours now, we became a community interest company 3-4 years ago. And we pride ourselves on looking at repurposed buildings, but where we can tell the history. And so I think a couple of notes I've made from what other people are saying. I think what's very clear to me is to try and get the community, people like me who've lived here all my life. So many people say, well, I didn't know about that. How did that happen? And really, is that true? Are these myths, these stories really true? So I think what you want to do is create a spirit of place, a real sense of belonging, and a real interest, which helps to generate civic pride. School children coming on some educational tours. We have a very iconic town hall, designed and built by Sir Charles Barry. Sadly, he died before it was completed, but his son finished that. Opened in 1863, and the Prince of Wales, who became Edward VII, actually came and opened that. It was a very rare occasion for a royal to come so far north of London. but thousands got off the train. You know, thousands of people came. And really, we're not going to recreate those times, but what we are wanting people to say is be proud of where you live, feel as though you've got a sense of belonging, a sense of identity. I saw something on the television yesterday about fly tipping. It's a completely different topic to what we're talking about tonight, but that some young people don't realize that's a criminal offense. So what do young people realize is their role in a community, their sense of belonging, and why they should protect, and all the things, Will, you've been saying, you know, and Louise earlier, talking to local communities, that's where the secrets are and the stories. And we pride ourselves on telling stories. People like stories. They like to know your own personal experience, and what it's like to live in a repurposed infirmary. You'd be amazed how many retired nurses come along and bring us their artifacts and everything, and we've got lots of things there for them to see. So really, it's just by an enjoyable experience, introducing people who can then discover more. So that's really, I think, a little bit of what I wanted to say. Of course, in amongst it all, the Peace Hall has been regenerated at a huge cost, but now it's becoming a venue for music. People talk about the Peace Hall, so it is quite iconic. And of course, Anne Lister, and this is where our relationship comes with York University, Victoria, isn't it? Because Danny and I were involved in a project at the Minster. COVID's been mentioned. COVID got in the way, so that particular project didn't get off the ground. But we had made connections with York University, with Dr. Kate Giles, and Danny and I, through Halifax Heritage Tours, have kept that relationship going. And so we're now looking at more academic research, which takes us above, in an elevated place, away from the intensity of Gentleman Jack and Anne Lister. You'll know about Sally Wainwright's famous TV series and everything, and of course all the other plays and series that Sally Wainwright, a local person, has written, which has started to put Halifax on the map. So I think we're on the cusp with Halifax Heritage Tours of increasing that. You know, we have the tallest folly in the world, Wainhouse Tower, 150 years old this year. So we've lots of things here. So I encourage you to visit, and we can extend some of the stories that we want to tell. But I'll let Danny take over because she's done the very close relationship on an academic level with York University. So thank you for your time, everybody. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Chris.
Danny, okay.
I'll try not to take too much time, but I just would like to echo a lot of what Chris has said in terms of us being established as a relatively young community interest company, to tap into the exponential growth that there's been in Halifax, the interest from more so tourists and local people. But we knew that local people of a certain age were interested in their heritage. We realised that younger people, we're getting to be an older demographic here in Calderdale. Younger people needed to have aspirations and prospects here as well, and that tourism was that prospect. So by creating the CIC, we hoped that we would be able to sort of have that intergenerational cohesion, find different ways of them being everybody being interested together in heritage here. And luckily, as Chris said, we were really fortunate to be introduced to IPUPS and Dr. Victoria Hoyle, and I've had that relationship now for 4 years. And in doing so, we've had a number of opportunities, not just from that, but also that have come from things that we've done and have grown. So we've had students that have done sort of particular research for us, but also looked into particular walking tours. We've had students that have created resources. There was a particular school who wanted to look into its own heritage. It had Victorian heritage from one of the main philanthropic families of the area. They wanted to engage with alumni. They wanted to show local children that they could come to this grammar school, that it was something that they should be proud of, or if children were walking past to another school, that it's something they could be proud of. So that door was opened through sort of research from a student from the master's placement from IPUPS. We also sort of looked into sort of banking heritage with an internship. Here we have a number of buildings, as Chris has already said, that are in need of care, their heritage at risk. We work closely with the Civic Trust, and we knew that a lot of buildings were closed, but we wanted them to be rejuvenated in the same way as the Peace Hall has. We cannot have one building that is the island that sustains us. So the whole of heritage across Halifax has to be focused on. And we knew of a local developer who'd purchased a number of buildings. So on our walks and tours, we always promote his input into Halifax. But in particular, he bought one of the prestigious heritage buildings relating to our banking heritage. Halifax has a very strong banking heritage, and it was something that we'd always wanted to tap into. So we were very fortunate to have a student last year who looked at the prospect of us furthering that, and we managed to sort of put them in touch with some of the retired bank managers from different banks. So we were looking into living memory as well. We're also looking at the prospect of connecting in with local playhouse and some of the actors there, so that we can possibly inject some walking characters in the tour when we deliver it. So we're trying to find different ways to engage with youth. It was very interesting to speak to a student and find out her concept of sort of banking was very, very different to ours and our knowledge of the heritage. Most students haven't been into a bank. Everything is virtual. So it helped us have that insight into how we can connect with a wider audience about banking and make it interesting for them. The school that I talked about before has now sort of taken things even further. We have a local history group that's going in to research some of their distinguished old boys. We also had a student last year who connected with some of the Elizabethan heritage. It was a boys' school which had merged into that grammar school with Elizabethan heritage, with an ageing group of old boys in the association who wanted to find a missing charter. They wanted that to be their legacy. We've taken steps towards sort of finding sort of more information as to where it might be. We haven't actually discovered it yet. It's that holy grail, but we'll keep working towards that. But also we looked at the prospect of whether there was actually some Elizabethan heritage below the Victorian replacement for the building. So the student that came had some archaeological background, and she looked into earthworks for the area as well to see whether we could further that. She's given us a wonderful report, which will now enable us to look to do talks, raise more interest, and possibly look for further funding. So by connecting with those community groups as a CIC, we see our role as drawing different groups together, different heritage groups together. A lot of local history groups aren't actually incorporated. They don't have the ability to apply for grant funding. So it means that we can be that umbrella, that connection. We can bring the researchers, the people with the academic ability to be able to service those interests. We've also worked closely with, we worked with a local MP, which is an interesting development for us. She wanted to have a walk to raise funds for the Women's Centre last year for International Women's Day. That led to us creating a notable women's walk, which again, sort of with the interest that there is in lost female stories at the moment, was something that has raised a lot of interest. It also involved a legacy from a local lady who was lesser known, but had played a significant role in the trade unions as a female at a time when females sort of weren't there. She was the inspiration for it. She also inspired a local exhibition, which drew a number of local female leaders from different spheres, different cultures, different organizations to come together to create some woven representations of their lives, which are sort of now circulating different venues in the area. So we've been able to highlight that tour. We've also been able to highlight some of the research that the local library had done into some of these notable women. So some of their exhibitions have been highlighted in their research. They've also kindly worked with us to give literature that we can hand out to some of the women that might want to then research female stories themselves, whether it be their own sort of female relatives or whether it be somebody else locally that they're interested in. We're about to do that again for the Anne Lister Festival, which is a festival which has developed in recent years here over over and around the birthday of Anne Lister. So it starts on the 28th of March this year. We're actually conducting 14 events this year for them. So we'll be servicing like up to 300 people on that occasion. In listening to that audience, there were certain things that they wanted to be able to do that they couldn't achieve because they couldn't get there. So we've actually managed to sort out a bus tour to one venue that relates to Anne Lister's diaries, and done research again for a walking tour there, and connected in with Rachel Whitbread, who is the daughter of Helena Whitbread, who, for those of you who know the Anne Lister legacy, was the lady who first nurtured the interest in the decoded diaries. So in being able to do that, we've made so many more connections. We're working with the council to highlight things as well. The Hebble Trail is part of the next chapter for development of Halifax, drawing cycling routes into town. That's a phase that currently, sadly, because of funding, is on hold. But heritage can open so many routes and connect so many different parts of the community, and by listening to those different things and making sure that we can be that connective service, we're hoping that we can grow and go from strength to strength. So I'll leave it at that, and hope that that gives you some more information about Halifax.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead,
just add one final thing on that, because we have a lot of asylum seekers and immigrants staying in the town. We have some very good, again, not-for-profit organisations that look after that. So there's a very strong role here to introduce new people to our area, so they can, they've been through really difficult times. They have huge potential as individuals, but that's difficult to manage for the centres, and for us to be able to encourage them through, we don't do any English speaking with them, but the centres do that. But if we can introduce them to the area that they're now living in, they don't all stay here. But I think that's a really valuable outreach that we're doing. So as Danny said, connecting with all aspects of community feels to be a really important part of our work. I don't think necessarily we started with that 4 years ago, but it's just fascinating how how you grow and develop and match need as it arises. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both Chris and to Danny, and also to Louise and Will. So we're now going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. You're very welcome to post your questions into the chat, where I will read them out and put them to the speakers. Alternatively, if you prefer, you can use the raise hand function, and you can then unmute yourself and speak when invited. The raise hand function, for those who are less familiar with Zoom, if you go down to the bottom of the screen and hover over the options, there's a react button. If you click on the react button, it will then give you a range of options, including raise hand. So if you would like to use that, then please do. While people are thinking through their questions, putting them in the chat, I will take advantage and ask a question to get us started. And this is a question that I think is really relevant to you all, because I was really struck by something that Chris said. She said, people like stories. And that, I thought, brought together a theme of all of your presentations, which is that they were often about telling a story. And so I thought I would begin by asking you, what makes a good story for a place-based history? I don't know if someone wants to kick us off with their thoughts on that. Will?
Yeah, I've thought about this a bit, because I work a lot with the medieval past, and it can be quite accessible and strange. My way in, this may be echoed, is to find kind of points of emotional kind of contact or similarity. I think, historians have to be careful to understand how emotions are quite different from time and place. But I think at a basic level, aspects of kind of sympathy, grief, enjoyment, so on, are really good ways of kind of getting the foot in the door of telling a story. Yeah, that's what I've used in the different things that I've worked on.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Louise, Chris, or Danny, do you have thoughts too? Louise?
Well, just saying, in my own practice, I really tried to uncover the stories of people that don't normally get to tell their stories. So LGBTQ plus, women's history, also working class history, because it's very easy to tell the story of the Lord of the Manor. It's not so easy to tell the story of his labourer, you know, but it is possible. I found that certain themes really connect with people. I wasn't particularly into it, but in most of the communities that I've worked with, people want to know what happened there during the war. How did people cope with the war? So most of my outputs have included something in that ilk as well. But anything I find interesting, I hope that other people will find interesting. And I think if you are enthusiastic about telling a story, that will translate to your audience. That's my personal experience anyway.
Thank you so much. Chris, Danny, do you have thoughts about what makes a good story? You've got plenty of stories, Chris, I know. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I think I've got a bit of a reputation for telling stories. Certainly my son will say, "Oh, Mum, you know, stop the Halifax stories, you know, don't swallow the pill today, you know, I just want an ordinary conversation." But actually now grandchildren are saying, "I really like your stories, Granny." And it's really just telling it, as you've just said, Louise, from the real human angle. And you know, the older I get, the more I realize some of the stories that got passed down from my family, my parents, aunts and uncles, that I kind of dismissed. You know, it was just kind of, oh gosh, you're going, yeah, a bit like my son, you know, you're going on again. But actually, you realize the resonance of that with lives today. They are relevant. And, you know, for example, Dean Clough that I mentioned, it's fascinating speaking to people who have worked there, you know, the sound of the clogs on the cobbles, waking you up in the morning as a child. Those kind of things, just, you know, if he's talking to children about that, well, what are clogs and what are cobbles? And that opens up another conversation, doesn't it? And so yeah, sometimes you can go on a little bit too much about it. But I think, you know, the stories about Anne Lister, for example, and of course, Sally did that so well in The Gentleman Jack with the marching down the street and the character that she was. I mean, her nickname locally in those days was Gentleman Jack because she dressed very austerely, did a lot of walking, took on the men of the town. Took them on, and I think that's to be celebrated. It doesn't matter about her sexuality. It's about a woman of her time, in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. You know, died young in 1841, but you know, she had put her mark on the town. From a business point of view, so it's and people like a bit of intrigue, you know, a little bit of intrigue, a little bit of naughtiness. My husband will tell about when he was done, it's a Yorkshire saying, for underage drinking at age 14 in the oldest pub in the town. And of course, on the tours, people love to hear things like that because they can identify with it. And I think if you can find those unlocking bits and pieces that say, yeah, well, I think, yeah, I can identify with that, then that's how you build up the repertoire, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I can see you're unmuted, Danny. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I think one thing that we're proud of in terms of how we and our volunteers, because we're all volunteers in giving the guided tours, seek to do is to listen to the audience. So we're not just telling them the stories, we're listening to their stories as well. And then we can carry those stories forward with other walking tours that we do. So we add and change our stories all the time. Two that spring to mind. One was in relation to one building that has just won a Civic Trust Award, the old Victorian Borough Magistrates Court. We invited some of the former magistrates to come along and tell us their stories, which we're now relating to the audiences that come along. And that makes them quite real for sort of the average person when we talk about sort of the family court and how somebody that wasn't actually very happy with the outcome decided to grab the jug of water from the table and tip it over the head of the magistrate. So two of the lady magistrates the following day turned up with shower caps on, ready for what might happen. So it's picking up those sort of stories, and then being on the bus that we do a bus tour by the Peace Hall, people talking about the various guises the Peace Hall has had. It's been amongst many things, the markets. And somebody recalled that during the war, when we had the only bomb dropped in Halifax, his grandmother had been given a key because some of the rooms were redundant at the time in the building, and all of the buildings that had a bomb dropped on them, their possessions had been put into separate rooms within the Peace Hall. And she went to collect her key from the town hall, went to get into the room purely because it had snowed overnight and she wanted her Wellington boots, and only one Wellington boot had survived. So these are the stories you pick up as you go around that people are telling you when you're telling them things too. So I think that's an important part of what we do.
Thank you. Yes, and there's been some good sort of contributions as well in the chat about stories, that they can be a comfort in shared experience, that they, they fuel people's curiosity for new information about old subjects. Louise pointing out that the stories that people often like are the naughty, scandalous, supernatural and weird stories, which I think comes across in just what you were saying then, Danny, and also that they humanise history, and I think that connects back to what Will was saying about emotion and tapping into people's emotional responses. Would anyone in the room like to ask a question? Please do raise your hand with the react button. Ruth.
Thank you so much for all those wonderful presentations and stories as well. It's lovely to hear the stories. And I was really interested in how all of you have kind of talked about the amount of buy-in, using Will's language, that you've got from local community members, and everything that Chris and Danny have been saying about how this buy-in is part of kind of developing civic pride and sense of place. But I just wondered kind of how easy you had find getting buy-in, or how much work that had been for you, and then how you kind of maintain that buy-in or kind of manage your relationship with local communities to sort of develop and keep it going while you're doing, particularly in Chris and Danny's case, you've got these really long ongoing projects and you seem to be doing all sorts of wonderful things. Like how are you kind of continuing to develop that relationship with the local community?
I think a lot of it is word of mouth. Where, as I said, many years ago, Sue and I, well, Sue was at the town hall, and so she's quite an expert on the town hall, and is still doing a lot throughout the year. But I think people will say, "Oh, I've heard about that from somebody else, and I'd really like to come." We're also getting people getting in touch with us to say, "Can we do a bespoke one for them?" So, for example, Sue's done some talks recently with the Society for the Blind. And of course, they're not all people who were born blind, they were people who've gone blind. And actually, she only said the other day, they want a bus tour. So we'll have to do a really good, we do a narrative on the bus tour, but then they can bring in their stories and they still feel valued as individuals, even though they can't see. And if we're telling them, well, this is the almshouses, this is People's Park and so on, their stories come as a result of that. And so I think then word of mouth comes and somebody else will get in touch with us and say, can you do? We've even done something for the local council. Actually, we got a new director of public services, and I, on a bit of a soapbox, said, all these people you employ in tourism and heritage and all that sort of thing, how much do they know about the town? So we took them all on a bus tour. We had 2 full buses and sort of said, you might live in Wakefield, but actually you're working in Halifax and this is the town that you're promoting and these are the stories that go with it. So I think it's a lot of it's word of mouth, and just building up a bit of a reputation with it, really. So each one get one, if you like.
Thanks, Chris. I love the way you said even the local authority, expressing that additional challenge that's obviously represented by local authorities. Sorry, Louise, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that it's much easier to get passive recipients or passive people joining your project than it is to actually get volunteers to work with you over a year or two to create something. But that's certainly what I found. Hundreds of people, for example, engaged with the Bremhill Parish History Project by coming along to one of our talks or festivals, but actually it was a central core of really enthused volunteers that stayed with us throughout the creation of the book, which took a couple of years. So yeah, so it's kind of it's different strokes for different folks, but it's good if you can create something which will bring in lots of people in lots of different ways, because I think it's good. You can have different outputs for different people, basically, for different types of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the same. Kind of English heritage is the opposite kind of end of the spectrum. It's in origin it was a state organization, right? So it's top down, and its relationship with communities hasn't always been good. And until 15, 20 years ago, working with volunteers wasn't something that English heritage did, full stop. So as an organization, very much learning as we go. We've recently undergone a restructure, which has seen a kind of a hiring of more people effectively to work with volunteers, because we recognize, or the organization recognizes, that there is a huge amount of potential there. I think for me personally, it does take individuals who are kind of quite keen to kind of emerge and present themselves. Certainly for Penrith, the volunteer kind of put herself forward. She approached me with a fully finished guidebook for the castle, effectively, which she had written, and it's about meeting where they want to be met, I suppose, and showing them the options as to where things can go. But I want to say I think big organisations like English Heritage can sometimes learn rather than lead on aspects of working with volunteers, I think. But I mean, I'm just now embarking on a project at Chester Castle, which is like Penrith, has been a free site, but it's been closed for most of the year, and it's open on select days. And the volunteers there have done extraordinary work. They are bringing in visitors in greater numbers than some of the properties that people have to pay to get into, such as their ability to bring the history to life at Chester Castle. And it's been a revelation for a lot of people, I think, to see how with the right kind of fostering of relationships and kind of a long-term investment, I think that's a really big part of working with volunteers, to kind of be there and be a familiar face. It's yielded a huge amount in terms of interest and kind of excitement around the castle there. So yeah.
That's really exciting. We have a question in the chat from G4Wings, who asks, how best to engage younger generations? Is it through the use of technology, through different activities? What works best in your experience?
If we're talking about school-age children, sort of like up to 11, I've done some children's events focused on some of the stories that we brought out in the project. And I've worked with some very good education officers at local museums. So we've introduced them to artifacts, to dressing up. We got kids trying to recreate some remedies that I found in a book, which was sort of great fun and entirely messy. We got kids decorating biscuits in the style of Roman tiles, lots of stuff like that. I think older kids is much more difficult to crack, and on this next project that I'm doing on the History Festival that we're hoping to do in Chippenham next year, we're actually working with a local drama group that works with young people, so that we're hoping to work with them to create something about one of the stories that we've uncovered about people living there in the past. So engaging with schools is sometimes quite difficult too, because they can be quite kind of closed off. So I think in some of the projects I've been involved in, there's been a lot of dead ends with local schools, but and they don't really have the time. They're trying to work to very narrow curriculum, and the kind of things that we are presenting them aren't necessarily ones that engage with aspects of the curriculum. So yeah, it's difficult and it's complicated, but you can do it.
Thanks, Louise. How about for Will, Danny, Chris?
I'll just briefly, working with schools as a big organisation, originally state that they've well keyed into the curriculum. I mean, I review GCSE, the contributions from the exam boards, for example. So we're very kind of keyed in on the education side. Similarly, on sites, engaging with histories, it's trails, it's puzzles, it's games, it's dressing up. There is a castle in Yorkshire that I worked on where there was a bear ward, is a bear keeper for bear baiting at the castle in the 12th century, and so we had a bear costume. That was amazing fun. In terms of kind of kids slightly older, it is tricky. I kind of echo that, but we've also taken that route for another project that I'm working on at Helmsley Castle, also in Yorkshire, where we'll get young people to take as a point of departure very fragmentary records of the kind of people who don't get talked about at castles, so servants, a monk who was accused of witchcraft, an Icelandic immigrant, so on, from the 15th century. And we're going to get them to kind of creatively imagine their story, drawing on their own experiences. So, a lot of things are being deployed to try and engage young people. I will say, young people are just kind of younger versions of adults, and it takes all sorts to meet them in their heritage. So, I've met young people at Chester who were interested in weapons, but also wanted to hear about music and textiles and food and daily life. So all sorts, I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's exciting at Helmsley. That's one of my local English heritage sites. So I shall be watching out for that. Danny.
I was going to mirror first what was been said about connections with schools. I think part of the problem is that people that are actually leading in so especially with primary schools, have it as a stepping stone, so they're only there for a couple of years. It's that continuity, it's limited budgets and time to fit things into the curriculum. Again, so with primary school, it's that local history connection for curriculum. For the senior school side of things, we've been lucky with some of the projects that we've had because they have wanted to connect with alumni and establish that local heritage side of things. But I think we've also looked into a pilot scheme for Duke of Edinburgh volunteering for students, because we thought that was another route in. And also we've been looking at the prospect of more recently whether the Anne Lister Festival can connect with senior schools for the PSHCE. So the sort of the way that Anne Lister's personal experiences could be used within that capacity within schools. So, but I do agree that it is something that we would like to generate more sort of materials and more sort of outside the box type thinking to be able to connect. We're particularly sort of concerned that local children need to engage with their local heritage, because there might be prospects of jobs here if we can generate that, but there's only a window to be able to generate that interest, or we'll lose that generation, they go elsewhere again. So it is an interesting point.
Thank you all. So any further questions in the room? I do have another question if other people are hanging back. Okay, so I will ask my second question and take the privilege of that. So I mean, something I think that again came up through all of your talks in one way or another was how place-based histories are funded, and where how a lot of this activity is being resourced. Some of that is obviously through in-kind contributions from local communities, but some of it is also coming from funders too. And we hear a lot about the kind of increasing challenges of the resource and funding landscape. So I wondered from each of you what you felt was the future of place-based history funding. Where's the money going to come from? I don't know if anyone wants to start us off. Sorry, that's a challenging question to leave us with this evening. I know, big question, Catherine. Yeah, I know. If the four of you could just solve the issue of heritage funding in the next 7 minutes, that would be wonderful. Louise.
I don't really know, but I have been surprised that there is money. Parish councils do have money to invest in outputs, in books. Museums, the same. So I don't volunteer my services. I am a freelancer and I do support myself through my craft. So yeah. So I have been surprised. So I agree, and it's going to get more challenging, but there is still money out there and organizations do want to invest. And there are people like the Heritage Lottery Fund who will continue to finance certain things. So yeah. Yeah,
Thanks,
that's just what I wanted to say. Not that that's
so it's a hopeful picture. Will, I know Danny was unmuted.
Oh, sorry.
I'll just bring her in and then come back to you. Yes, thank you.
Right. No, I was just going to say that sort of funding is, it's no doubt it is an issue, which is why when we first set ourselves up and were incorporated, we created ourselves as a community interest company, because that can, although it's treated as not profit making, it can make profits as long as it's injected back into the objectives for the community that we've set ourselves out to benefit. So we can charge for our walking tours and talks and other things. We also can work in collaboration with, at the moment we're looking at the prospect of a trail that was published some years ago, over a decade ago, renewing that for sort of a children's trail. And in doing that, we might be able to generate some funds through some publications. We're also looking at that with another separate project where somebody had created a sketchbook of drawings of some of the famous buildings in the area. So we were able to establish ourselves through a town centre board grant at the beginning, and we've managed to sustain that and add to it over time. But there is a lot of volunteer time that goes into it, and we do have to constantly look at how that can be sustainable. So it is something that needs to be revisited on a regular basis.
Thanks, Danny. I don't know whether purposefully or not, but you have also helpfully answered Ruth's question from the chat about how you became a community interest company and how that works. So thank you. That was wonderful. Will.
Yeah, so the work of English Heritage is funded exclusively now through payments of members. So you become a member of English Heritage and that goes into a pot. But you know, it's not a secret that we're going through a restructure, and so like a lot of people, the funding landscape is very challenging. I think I mentioned Chester because Chester Castle is kind of something of a way that some sites might generate their own funding in ways that an organisation which looks very top down hasn't necessarily recognised before. I think another thing which is not an innovation, but it's worth saying, is kind of collaboration and kind of in-kind exchanges. So again, for Chester, the local university is interested in trialling out some new technology to investigate aspects of the castle's history, for example, and that is something that we would be interested in that has no monetary cost up front, but we could be partners in that investigation. I think that is a model that is kind of tried and tested in other places. The final thing I suppose that is worth remarking on is kind of philanthropy, or the role that high net worth individuals, to put it in the lingo, have to play in bringing money to heritage. I'm thinking of the program Bloomberg Connects. I don't know if anybody knows it. Bloomberg it Connects is effectively a program funded by Michael Bloomberg, where heritage sites, great and small, from organizations like English Heritage down to local museums, are able to create digital guides and audio guides that can be uploaded onto a shared app. And so that gives especially organizations that don't have the capacity to kind of keep technology and all that sort of thing to be able to contribute different kinds of media. And then in terms of fundraising, yeah, it's about finding people who buy into the cause, and part of that is demonstrating value to community and value to volunteers. So it kind of, you know, pulls us that direction as well. I should say, as someone from a big organization, I am largely kept from these sorts of discussions because I get left with the castles, which is sometimes a good thing. But yeah.
Thanks, Will, and thanks for that reminder about Bloomberg Connects, which has just been linked in the chat, which I'm seeing more and more heritage organisations looking at and benefiting from. And there are also some additional recommendations in the chat as well about some of the pots of funding that are available through private business and also through some large landowners as well, which is very helpful. I think that is all that we have time for in terms of questions. Thank you to all of our panelists again for their contributions. I'll hand back over now to Ruth to finish us off. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you for everybody for all your comments in the chat as well. So this session has been recorded. It will be uploaded onto the Centre for the History of People, Place and Communities online events archive, and I will email everybody who signed up to let you know when it's available. Today's session is the final event in our winter-spring term, but as you will have seen at the beginning, we've got a kind of lively set of events beginning at the end of April for our spring summer term. So do have a look at the CHPPC website for those, and Victoria also included a slide in there about a public history conference, so if that sounds of interest to you, then please also have a look into that as well. So thank you very much for everybody for coming.